Once upon a time, the village of Umuamara had long feared Chief Edward. He was an old man, in his late 70s, with piercing eyes that seemed to see through a person's soul. He had 25 sons and only one daughter, born to him by 4 different wives. Edward was not an ordinary man. He was a ritualist, a man who believed in the darkest traditions, one who would do anything to keep himself alive and powerful. People whispered behind his back, afraid to say his name too loudly. For years, death had followed his family like a shadow. His brother's children never lived long enough to see old age. Whenever Edward's time was near, when sickness weighed him down, a tragedy would strike. One of his nephews would fall ill and die mysteriously. And just like that, Edward would become healthy again, strong as ever. Nobody could prove it, but deep down, they all knew. Then one fateful evening, everything changed. Edward's youngest brother, Patrick, had gone to his farm to check on his crops. As he walked through the tall cassava plants, his foot struck something hard. Curious, he bent down and dug around the spot. His hands trembled as he pulled out a small, wrapped bundle. When he opened it, his heart almost stopped. Inside was a carved wooden doll, tied with red and black threads, with cowries and strange symbols drawn all over it. Patrick's voice shook with fear as he whispered, "This is evil." He knew immediately what it meant. Edward was preparing another blood exchange. Patrick ran back to the village, his feet barely touching the ground. He called for an emergency village meeting, and within minutes, the town square was filled with men, women, and elders. Edward was dragged out of his house. For the first time in his life, he looked afraid. "Edward, is it true?" the village chief asked. "Are you still killing your brother's children to stay alive?" Edward's lips quivered. I don't know what you're talking about." "Liar!" Patrick shouted, throwing the bundle at his feet. "I found this buried in my farm. Do you deny it?" The villagers roared in anger. Some picked up sticks and stones. "You will swear today," one man shouted. "Yes, if you ever harm your brothers or their children again, you will be buried alive." Edward had no choice. He was forced to swear an oath before the village shrine. His hands trembled as he placed them on the sacred stone, knowing the consequences of breaking such a vow. From that day, Edward changed. At least, that was what people thought. He no longer touched his brother's children. But evil cannot leave the heart of a wicked man so easily. He found another way. Instead of using his nephews, he turned to his own children. One night, his household was shaken by loud cries. His eldest son, Daniel, the only university graduate in the family, had collapsed suddenly. His mother screamed, shaking him, "Daniel, open your eyes." She wept, but Daniel was gone. Just like that. Nobody knew who to blame. Edward himself cried the loudest, beating his chest, rolling on the ground like a man who had lost everything. But those who were sharp-eyed noticed something strange. Just a week before Daniel died, Edward had been very sick. He could barely walk. People thought his time had come. Yet, on the morning Daniel died, Edward stepped out of his house looking younger, healthier, stronger. The whispers began again. Something was not right. The whispers spread like harmattan wind, but no one dared to confront Edward. Can he truly do that to his own son? Some asked in hushed voices. "It's not possible." Others replied. "He trained him, sent him to the university. Why would he kill his only educated child?" Doubt crept in. People shook their heads, trying to convince themselves that Edward, despite his dark ways, would never harm his own flesh and blood. Slowly, the rumors faded. Life returned to normal. The villagers went back to their daily activities, pretending as if nothing had happened. But inside Edward's compound, a storm was brewing. Among all his children, there was one who stood out not for strength or power, but because she was different. His only daughter, Olivia. Edward despised her. From the moment his occult brothers warned him never to father a female child. He had tried everything to prevent her birth. When his last wife became pregnant and a seer told him the child would be a girl, he performed several rituals to end the pregnancy. But Olivia was destined for great things. She survived every attempt to erase her existence and came into the world, screaming like a warrior. And from that day, she became his greatest challenge. Unlike his sons, who obeyed him without question, Olivia had a mind of her own. She never hid her dislike for him. If he asked her to fetch water, she would fold her arms and say, "No, I won't." If he told her to sweep the compound, she would shake her head. "Why do you always refuse me?" Edward once asked her, his voice cold with anger. "You are not a good man," Olivia replied fearlessly. "I will not serve you." The first time she said those words, his entire household froze. No one spoke to their father that way. But Olivia was different. She was stubborn, bold, and unshaken by his threats. Edward tried to make her life miserable. He denied her food, hoping she would crawl back and beg, but she found a way to survive, eating from neighbors and kind-hearted villagers who saw the way she was treated. He sent his sons to beat her, but she fought back with a strength no one understood. Even when they overpowered her, she never cried. "She's not normal," his second wife once whispered to him. "Maybe she's protected by something stronger than you." Edward refused to believe it. He tried several times to harm her, using charms, invoking spirits, but nothing worked. No sickness, no accident, no misfortune touched her. She remained untouched, walking around with an air of confidence that made his blood boil. One day, one of his closest friends, an elder in the occult, called him aside. "Let her be," the man warned. "You can't harm her. If you try, she will be the end of you." Edward's face darkened. "No one defies me and lives to tell the story." "You have killed many, Edward," the man said. "But this one, she is different. Let her go, or she will destroy you." But Edward was not a man who listened to warnings. He had spent his entire life bending destiny to his will. He would not stop now. No matter what it took, he would break Olivia, or she would be his downfall. Edward had sworn to make Olivia suffer. If he could not destroy her directly, he would make her life unbearable. One afternoon, Olivia was working in the farm, cutting down weeds with her machete, when she heard a rustling sound behind her. She turned and froze. A massive snake, thick and black, slithered toward her, its tongue flicking in and out. Instead of running, Olivia gripped her machete tighter. The snake lunged at her, but with one swift strike, she cut off its head. Blood splattered on the dry earth as the snake's body twisted before going still. What Olivia didn't know was that her father had sent the snake. Edward had been sitting in his hut, waiting to hear the news that his stubborn daughter was dead. But instead of cries, he heard Olivia's cheerful voice as she returned from the farm, carrying the dead snake over her shoulder. Edward's heart pounded in shock. "Papa, look at what I killed today," Olivia said, dropping the snake in front of him. His face darkened. "Who asked you to bring this into my house?" He snapped. "Stay away from my farm, and stop killing every animals you see on my farmland. I won't warn you again." He didn't want anyone to suspect him. If people found out he was behind the attack, they would question him again. He had sworn before the village not to harm his brother's children, but nobody had said anything about his own. Their hatred for each other grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, while Edward sat outside his house, a group of young men, accompanied by some elders, walked into his compound. He sat up and forced a smile. "You are welcome," he greeted, hiding his curiosity. "What brings you here?" One of the elders cleared his throat. "One of these young men is interested in Olivia," he announced. "He wishes to marry her." Edward raised a brow. "Is that so?" He looked at the young man, who stood with confidence. "Yes, sir," the suitor said. I love Olivia and wish to make her my wife. Edward nodded thoughtfully. No problem, he said, pretending to be pleased. Come back in a week. I will discuss it with Olivia and see if she is ready. The men thanked him and left. But Edward already had his plans. Let her get married, he muttered under his breath. But she won't last long in that marriage. He would make sure of it. But before he could execute his plans, tragedy struck again. The next morning, a loud cry shattered the silence of the compound. Wailing filled the air as people gathered to see what had happened. Edward had lost another son. This one was different. He was the most obedient of all Edward's children, the one he loved the most. He had never questioned his father's ways, never disobeyed him. Edward locked himself in his room and wept bitterly. He clenched his fists and cursed under his breath. I told you not to touch this one, he shouted. Why take my favorite? What happened to the other ones? He had sacrificed too much for his occultic brothers, but this time they had gone too far. Unknown to him, Olivia had been standing outside listening. Then her voice rang through the room, cold and filled with anger. Papa! Edward turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. She stepped forward, her eyes burning with fury. This should be the last time you renew your powers with any of my brothers, she warned. Her voice was steady, firm. Without waiting for a response, she stormed out. Edward stared after her, shaken. Meanwhile, the villagers had begun to whisper again. 2 grown sons, dead in 3 years? What is really happening? Some suspected Edward. Others refused to believe he could harm his own children. But deep down, everyone knew something dark was at play. Weeks after their first visit, the men who had come to ask for Olivia's hand in marriage returned. This time, they were prepared. They brought drinks, money, and gifts for the traditional rites. After her bride price was paid, Olivia followed her new husband home. Her husband, Michael, was a patient and understanding man. He knew Olivia had been raised in a difficult home, so he treated her with care. He never raised his voice at her, never forced her to do anything she didn't want to do. At first, Olivia was distant. She wasn't used to kindness, but over time, she began to relax. She took care of the house, respected Michael, and treated his family with warmth. It didn't take long before they all grew to love her. Months passed, and Olivia remained in her husband's house, happy and peaceful. But back in her father's compound, Edward waited. By now, he had expected Olivia to come running back in disgrace. He had cast a powerful spell on her, a spell meant to drive men away from her. No man was supposed to stand her. No husband was supposed to keep her. Yet, she was still in her husband's house. Edward's anger grew with each passing day. What is going on? He muttered to himself, pacing his hut. Why hasn't she come back? He had used the strongest charms, the ones his occultic brothers had given him. How could they fail? Something wasn't right. Meanwhile, in Olivia's home, life went on smoothly. One evening, after dinner, Michael called Olivia inside. He sat on the edge of their wooden bed, watching her as she arranged the room. Come, sit with me, he said gently. She walked over and sat beside him. For a moment, he was silent, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he spoke. Olivia, you know we have been married for months now, he began, and I know I haven't touched you yet. She nodded. Yes, I noticed. Michael reached for her hands. The reason is because I knew you were a virgin. I wanted to give you time, so you wouldn't feel pressured. Olivia's heart warmed. She had never known a man could be this patient. Thank you, she said, smiling, but I'm ready now. Michael smiled back and kissed her forehead. He blew out the oil lamp beside them, letting the soft moonlight filter through the small window. As they moved closer, Michael's fingers brushed against her lower body. He suddenly stopped. His entire body went rigid. His breath hitched. His hands trembled. Confused, Olivia looked at him. What's wrong? Michael didn't answer. His eyes were fixed below her waist, his face frozen in shock. He swallowed hard and tried to speak, but his voice barely came out. Olivia, what? What is this? She frowned. What are you talking about? With shaky hands, he reached for her again, this time, more carefully. He felt it again. His heart pounded. Michael jumped off the bed as though he had touched fire. Olivia. His voice was barely above a whisper. You have a... He couldn't even finish the sentence. Olivia's chest tightened. She looked down at herself, and then her blood ran cold. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands trembled. What are you saying? She whispered, her voice hoarse. Michael's face was pale. Olivia, why do you have a male reproductive organ? A heavy silence filled the room. Olivia's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her heartbeat thundered. Sweat formed on her forehead. Michael staggered backward, his face filled with disbelief. What was happening? Olivia was terrified. Her entire body shook as she clutched the bedsheet beneath her. Just moments ago, she had been a woman normal, just like every other woman she knew. But now, staring down at herself, she saw something that shouldn't be there. Her breathing became heavy. Her heart pounded. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she lifted her hands to her head. This can't be real, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael stood frozen, his face pale as if he had just seen a ghost. His lips parted, but no words came out. He kept blinking, as if hoping his eyes were deceiving him. Olivia, he finally managed to say. What is this? Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes. She quickly grabbed his hands and held them tightly. Michael, please. You have to believe me. I don't know what's happening to me. I swear. I have never seen this before in my life. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Michael took a shaky breath, trying to process the situation. Olivia's grip tightened around his hands. Please, don't tell anyone, she pleaded. Let this be our secret. I don't understand what's happening, but I will find a solution. Just don't let anyone know. Michael swallowed hard. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the genuine fear that consumed her. He knew Olivia, she was a kind woman, well-mannered, and full of respect. Whatever was happening to her, she didn't deserve it. Slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said softly. I won't tell anyone. A small sob escaped Olivia's lips. She wiped her tears quickly. Thank you, she whispered. Michael sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples. Let's just act like nothing happened, he said. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe our eyes were playing tricks on us. Olivia nodded, even though deep down, she wasn't convinced. She stood up, adjusted her wrapper, and walked back to her room. But just as she entered, something strange happened. She felt lighter. The heaviness that had suddenly appeared between her legs was gone. Confused, she looked down at herself. Her eyes widened. It was gone. The thing that had scared her just moments ago had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. She gasped and ran her hands over her body. It's really gone, she whispered in shock. She touched herself over and over again, trying to be sure. A smile broke out on her face. Without wasting another second, she ran back to Michael's room, flinging the door open. Michael, she called, excitement in her voice. Michael, who had been deep in thought, quickly turned to face her. What is it? He asked, standing up. Without saying a word, Olivia untied her wrapper and let it fall to the ground. Look, she exclaimed, pointing at herself. Michael's eyes widened. He slowly walked toward her, carefully inspecting her body. His brows furrowed as he crouched down slightly, double-checking to make sure he wasn't seeing things. His eyes met hers in astonishment. It's gone, he asked. Yes, Olivia cried out. It's gone. Whatever it was, it disappeared the moment I left your room. Michael let out a deep breath of relief and pulled her into a hug. Maybe we imagined it, he said, stroking her back gently. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Olivia held onto him tightly. I hope so, she murmured against his chest. Michael pulled away slightly, cupped her face and smiled. Don't be scared. Whatever happened, it's over now. She nodded, feeling safer in his arms. Just as she was about to step away, Michael gently traced his fingers along her arms, his touch warm and reassuring. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Stay with me tonight, he whispered. Olivia hesitated for a moment. She was still shaken by what had happened, but Michael's presence made her feel calm. She nodded. Okay. Michael smiled and pulled her back toward the bed. He wrapped his arms around her as they sat down together. Slowly, he began to touch her, his hands moving carefully as if trying to make her feel comfortable. Olivia closed her eyes, allowing herself to enjoy the warmth of his embrace. But just as the moment grew more intense, just as Michael was about to fully claim his wife, he suddenly froze. His entire body stiffened. His breathing hitched. His eyes widened in horror. No, he breathed, his voice trembling. Olivia's eyes snapped open. She didn't need to ask why he had stopped. She already knew. Michael pulled away from her as if he had been burned. He scrambled backward, almost falling off the bed. Olivia, he choked. His voice was laced with shock and fear. Olivia's heart sank. Slowly, she looked down at herself, and there it was. The thing she thought had disappeared had returned. Her blood ran cold. Her hands flew to her mouth. She shook her head violently. No, 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 she cried. Tears streamed down her face as she collapsed onto the bed, sobbing. Why is this happening to me? She wailed. Michael ran his hands through his hair, his breathing uneven. This is not normal, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia curled up into a ball, shaking uncontrollably. Michael hesitated, then slowly reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. Listen to me, he said firmly. No matter what is happening, you're still my wife. She sniffled and looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. I promise you, Michael continued, we will find a way to fix this. But for now, no one else can know about this. If people hear about it, they will not understand. They will judge you. They will call you names. Olivia wiped her tears, nodding weakly. Do you trust me? Michael asked. She hesitated, then nodded again. Yes, she whispered. Michael sighed and gently pulled her into his arms. Then don't be afraid, he murmured. We will get through this together. But as Olivia buried her face in his chest, one thought kept running through her mind. Was this truly something they could overcome? Or was it just the beginning of something far worse?